Hi, this is Stephen Murphy-Shigematsu, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about diversity, and especially diversity in Japan. My work is really based in my own family background, which originates in Japan. My father was an American who was there, living there after the war. My mother was a Japanese from Ehime. And we had a family that was mixed. With my father was welcomed into the family even though they weren't allowed to marry at the time because of the laws that existed in occupied Japan, but were not actually very different from the laws that existed in many of the United States, including California. So at that very time in California, my parents would not have been able to be legally married because they were considered to be of a different race. So issues of diversity really were part of my original family. Because of the differences in nationality laws, my older sisters were born as Japanese with the name Shigematsu. I was born as an American with the name Murphy. So these kinds of experiences that occurred very early in life helped me to become sensitized to issues of diversity, and to be seeking an understanding of what my own family background was. I knew that I had a family that came from Ehime. And when we went to the United States as a child, I learned that I had another family, which were the Murphy family, who had immigrated from Ireland. And that also raised the issues that were most prominent for me in childhood of religious diversity, because the Irish were Catholic mostly. And so that was part of my own upbringing in this Irish community as being Catholic, which was also different from a lot of my friends who were in other types of religious groups, mostly other Christians, but also some Jewish families. But even more prominent, I think it was the sense of racial diversity, because that was something that in which my family stood out, because we were the only people from Asia that anyone had ever seen, apparently. And so that made a certain type of curiosity, which sometimes, of course, was hostility, but it was something that we felt very clearly in that environment, but also a kind of cultural diversity, because we clearly had habits or ways of doing things and seeing things that were different from the people around us, and that was something that was probably not as apparent, but something that I had to learn to understand as I grew older. In my career, I first was in education, but then I started to look at issues of diversity. Originally in education, they were about multicultural education, anti-racism education, things that I did with very young children. But as I developed into the study of psychology, that was something that I also looked at in terms of the diversity that existed in my particular field of mental health, and how different societies looked at issues of illness and healing, and how there were different forms of mental health services that had a very deep cultural basis depending on people's background and what would be especially helpful for them in terms of the kinds of mental health services that were offered. And so this was part of my early career studying about diversity in the United States. But then I moved to the University of Tokyo, and that's where I became involved with issues that were seen as really important in Japanese society. So at the time, around 1980, then Prime Minister Nakasone formed a vision of how one aspect of Japanese society, the higher educational system, could become more international. And the government made a plan that by the year 2000, there would be 100,000 international students in Japan. And therefore, they needed a whole infrastructure in the national universities. And so I was hired at that time at the University of Tokyo to begin something which we called an international center. And that was really my introduction to the way in which Japanese society was starting to see the need for diversity. And while it was very good, I felt that there was this emphasis on bringing more international students to Japan. It was clear that there was also the desire that they return home, so that the government's programs did not provide with family support. And sometimes students were told very directly, leave your family home, you're here to study. And so there was a huge cultural gap with many of the people that were wanting to come to Japan, because they felt a clear sense that we are wanted there, but we are just temporarily, and we're not encouraged to stay, really. There was a program on NHK, at the time, the Japanese public broadcasting system, and it was a Japanese language program, and the first question that the Japanese asked to the international student was, "Itsu kimashita ka?" Which is, when did you come here? And then after the answer, she says, "Itsu kaerimasu ka?" And so that's, when are you going back? And to the international students, that was always something they thought was very humorous, whereas the Japanese who made the program obviously didn't think it was very funny. But it started by this experience, which I did for 11 years, started me to research much more about diversity in Japan. And the issues that were encountered were often really based in a whole sense of ideology, of homogeneity, that there was, especially in post-war Japan, an ideology that Japan was strong because of we are all the same. So the Japanese word that was being used was Taitsu Minzoku Kokka, the idea that Japan is a mono-ethnic society, and that's what gives us strength. And so, of course, this is something that is very difficult with an ideology like that to embrace diversity. And diversity was really seen as something racial, something that exists in other countries, but not in Japan. There was some recognition of ethnic diversity in terms of the population that had come from Korea, and there was recognition of that, although the nationality law changed after the war, in which they were Koreans were no longer Japanese citizens. And so that sense, awareness of diversity has always existed to some degree. But it's really in recent years that it's become a very big issue throughout society. The whole issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of every major corporation's agenda about how do we increase diversity, because it's something that's very necessary, especially in terms of the aging population in Japan, which is creating the need for greater labor, especially coming from other countries. But also the form that diversity is usually seen as taking is gender diversity. And therefore the corporations, all kinds of companies, universities have programs to increase the number of women who are not only parts of the companies and the schools, but also increasing their role in management level. So higher levels of corporations. And this is something that's true in companies, but also even in universities like the University of Tokyo, where recently there's been a lot more publicity about how the number of, the population of Todai students is extremely centered on, it's very heavily still young men. The professorship, of course, is still very heavily men. And the students also often come from the same class background in the big cities of Tokyo and Osaka. And so the representation in Todai universities like the University of Tokyo is very limited, and this is something that's becoming a lot more publicity about this type of lack of diversity. Sometimes diversity is seen in the companies as about abilities and disabilities, and so there's much more awareness of bringing in people who have certain types of disabilities, but also can offer abilities in other ways. There's more awareness these days about family diversity, the kinds of different families that, alternative families that compared to what is considered the ideal nuclear family. So many more families in which there are single parents, mostly single mothers. And this also raises the issue of class diversity, that there's an increasing awareness that there is a growing class differences in Japan, and that there is a population now of people who are really struggling to make their basic needs met in Japan. There's more awareness too of regional diversity, so something that is mostly apparent when you look at the extremities of Japan, and Okinawa, but also Hokkaido, that the differences in people in those areas is more apparent, but also throughout the Japanese other islands, the major islands of Honshu and Shikoku and Kyushu, you also see regional differences there in terms of how the local cultures. And you also, as I mentioned previously, you see much less representation of people from all these different areas of the country when they come to the major companies and schools, universities in Tokyo area, especially the most prestigious ones in those areas. And so there's much more recognition now of the need to increase regional diversity in terms of both at universities but also in companies. Another area that's come to the attention of a lot more people, both in companies but also in universities, is neurodiversity. So the diversity that exists in every human being in terms of the way our brains are structured and the way our brains function. And it's just much more recent compared to the awareness in countries like the United States about the ways in which humans differ by categories such as called ADHD, or kind of a Hatatsu Shogai, or things like autism, the Jiheisho, and what was once considered to be a clear line between somebody who is normal or abnormal, or healthy or unhealthy. There's much more awareness of what is called a spectrum, that every human being falls somewhere along this line of diversity, in which we have different abilities and different disabilities and different ways, different strengths and different weaknesses. And so there's a growing awareness that people who were once excluded from Japanese society are now seen as that they can be included with a recognition of not only what their disability but also their abilities, and how it's become very important in terms of team building, collaboration, cooperation, but also the dynamic structure of groups to recognize people who have different types of abilities and who could therefore form a very dynamic team. One of the things that's still confronting the embracing of diversity in Japan, though, is the sense of the ideology of homogeneity, and how that's something that has always been a strength for Japan. And so there's even a denial of the diversity that does exist. For example, of students at some schools being forced, who have naturally brown hair, being forced to dye their hair black, even though the school has a policy against dyeing their hair. So they're forced to dye their hair as though that's important to maintain this image that everybody is the same. In reality, of course, there is a great diversity even among all these people who are considered to be just the same Japanese. But this fear of diversity still continues when you see the kinds of rapid increase in the number of people who live in Japan now who come from other countries. It's also arousing a fear that this is threatening what makes Japan a really great country. And you see this sometimes in terms of what is called the fear of over-tourism. And so the people coming to Japan now as tourists even are sometimes not welcome because they feel like local people feel they're disrupting the sense of the local culture. And so these types of fears about how other people from other countries will change Japan is something that still really needs to be confronted. In order for Japan to become a society in which people feel that they're more able to be who they really are. So there are some surveys that say that maybe 10% of the population is lesbian, gay, or bisexual, but that's not something that you can come out very openly about, for example, in the ways in which American universities would have clubs, very public, in which you could join a club in which you would identify yourself by a certain sexual orientation. But there is more growing sense of that it's okay to express yourself in some circles, some awareness that there is the use of pronouns, as you see very commonly in the United States, a magazine called They, which makes it very clear that there are people who don't identify as he or she so clearly, but would like to identify with some other pronoun that would show a broader sense of identity. And so even though there are these fears, there's also a history in Japan of really respecting the individuality of different people. And it's something that I think is Japan can still draw on in the sense of engaging with diversity. And there are certain people who have led this type of effort. For example, Ototake-san, who was born without arms and legs, engaged a few years back with Ariana Miyamoto, I think was her name, but pointing out how the two of us are both very different, obviously different, because I don't have an arms or legs and your skin is darker than most Japanese, but I think that we can help others to recognize that there are huge numbers of people in Japan who feel their sense of uniqueness and want to express that, and feel that the society is really restricting them in that sense and holding them back from really being who they are, and that this is something that's very painful for human beings, to be locked into a society in which they feel that they have to pretend that they are somebody else and that they can't really express who they are. But as that becomes more desirable, and I think that will make it more possible for people to do that. And one example that we have is the popularity of the rugby national team in 2019, in which they were extremely successful, which surprised a lot of people because they said, how could such a diverse team, this was the most diverse team, national team in Japanese sports history, and people questioned, why were they so successful? And in an interesting way, they said, we are strong because we are diverse. And they said, we recognize our diversity and we have mutual respect for each other. The Japanese players respect the players from other countries. The players from other countries respect Japanese culture, and we're very conscious and intentional about doing that. But also, we recognize that because we are different, we have to communicate more clearly with each other, and therefore the way in which all Japanese groups sometimes assume that they don't need to communicate directly because they're all the same, we don't make that assumption, and we are very conscious of communicating very directly with words and in details, and that's what makes us a strong country. And so hopefully there are examples like this that will help other Japanese who don't see the strength of diversity to really believe that it is something that is not just necessary, but that it actually brings benefits. And so even though the difficulties of diversity can be quite apparent, I think that what is really needed now is for people to see what diversity can bring and how necessary that is when the world is changing so rapidly that it requires new solutions, innovative solutions, creative solutions, and that's what diversity brings, is that sense of dynamic energy to a group in which people have different ways of seeing things, different ways of doing things. And that's something that I think we can bring more to Japanese society, Japanese schools, Japanese groups, and that the education has to begin very early. You can begin not waiting till people get into companies to have diversity training, but hopefully in schools where kids learn at a very early age that we're really all the same human beings and that the differences are very minor, but also very important to recognize. And that if we recognize them and accept them, that that's something that can really help us to bring diversity into Japanese society, accepting the ways in which we ourselves are different, and also accepting the ways in which we are different from other people. Accepting ourselves and accepting others in that way, I think, can really enhance the acceptance of diversity in Japanese society, and because it's inevitable that the society will become more diverse. And so I think it's important to really address that in the educational system from a very early age, and to continue to address that in the company's level, but also at the governmental level, where it's often important to create policies that also enhance diversity. So this is a very brief introduction to my understanding of what diversity is in Japan, but I hope it helps you to understand a little bit better what some of the basic conditions and situations are today. Thank you.